February 10, 1944, the alarm sounded at 0530 hours at Luftwaffe fighter base, Jever in northwestern Germany. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler rolled out of his bunk, already knowing what the alarm meant. American bombers were coming again. It was the third raid this week, and Stigler was exhausted. His hands shook as he pulled on his flight suit. Not from fear, though fear was certainly present. The shaking came from something deeper, something that had been growing in him and every other German pilot for months now. The certainty that today might be the day he didn't come back. Stigler was 26 years old. He had been flying fighters since 1940. He had over 400 combat missions. He had 28 confirmed kills. By any measure, he was an experienced pilot, one of the expert aces that Germany relied upon to defend the homeland. But as he walked toward his Bf-109 in the pre-dawn darkness, Stigler felt something he had never felt before in all his years of combat. He felt defeated before the battle had even begun. The briefing was short. American heavy bombers, probably B-17s, were approaching from the west. Estimated number, over 200. Fighter escort, unknown. Target, probably Berlin or one of the industrial cities in the Ruhr. German fighters would scramble, climb to intercept altitude, and engage the bombers before they reached their targets. It was the same briefing Stigler had heard dozens of times before, but something was different today. The briefing officer's voice lacked conviction. The other pilots sat in silence. Nobody asked questions. Nobody made the usual jokes. They just sat and listened and absorbed the information with the grim acceptance of men who knew what was coming. Stigler climbed into his Bf-109 and went through the pre-flight checks with automatic precision. His aircraft was well maintained. The engine had been recently overhauled. The ammunition boxes were full. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. And yet Stigler knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that it wouldn't matter. None of it would matter if the Americans brought their new fighters. The Bf-109 roared to life. Stigler taxied to the runway, received clearance, and took off into the grey morning sky. Around him, other fighters were climbing, forming up into their combat formations. Stigler counted 15 aircraft in his grub, 15 fighters to intercept over 200 bombers. The mathematics were impossible, but they had done impossible things before. They would do them again. They had to. The climb to altitude took 20 minutes. 20 minutes during which Stigler tried to control his breathing, tried to calm his racing heart, tried to push down the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He had been afraid before. Every combat pilot felt fear, but this was different. This wasn't the sharp, immediate fear of combat. This was something deeper. This was the fear of obsolescence. The fear that everything he had learned, everything he had trained for, everything that had kept him alive for 4 years of war, was no longer enough. At 28,000 feet, Stigler spotted the bomber formation, a massive box formation, B-17s flying in tight defensive groups, their combined firepower creating an almost impenetrable wall of machine gun fire. Stigler had attacked such formations before. You came in from above and behind, diving fast to minimize your exposure to the defensive fire. You picked a target, usually a bomber that was trailing smoke or had fallen behind the formation. You lined up your shot, fired a burst, and immediately dove away before the defensive gunners could track you. It was dangerous work, but it was survivable if you were skilled and lucky. But Stigler wasn't looking at the bombers. He was scanning the sky around the formation, looking for the one thing that terrified him more than the massed defensive fire of 200 heavy bombers. He was looking for the escorts. He was looking for the fighters that he knew, with absolute certainty, would be there. He was looking for the Mustangs. And then he saw them, small silver shapes, almost invisible against the bright sky, weaving above and around the bomber formation like protective sheepdogs. P-51 Mustangs. Dozens of them. Maybe 50. Maybe more. Stigler felt his stomach drop. This was what he had been dreading. This was the nightmare that had been keeping him awake at night. This was the reason that more and more German pilots were finding reasons not to fly, were reporting sick, were asking for transfers to ground units because fighting the Mustang wasn't combat, it was suicide. Stigler keyed his radio. Acting, enemy fighters above the formation, multiple contacts. Appears to be P-51s. His voice was steady, professional, but his hands were shaking on the control stick. Around him, the other German pilots tightened their formations. Nobody responded to his warning. What was there to say? They all knew what the Mustang could do. They had all heard the stories from pilots who had survived encounters with them, and they all knew that many pilots hadn't survived to tell any stories at all. The Grupp commander's voice crackled over the radio. We proceed as planned. Attack the bombers. Ignore the fighters if possible. Ignore the fighters if possible. It was a death sentence disguised as a tactical order. You couldn't ignore the Mustangs. They wouldn't let you. That was the entire point of the Mustang. That was why the Americans had built it, to make sure that German fighters could never again attack American bombers without paying a terrible price. Stigler pushed his Bf-109 into a diving attack, aiming for a B-17 on the edge of the formation. His airspeed built up rapidly. 250 miles per hour. 300. 350. The B-17 grew larger in his gun sight. He could see the waist gunners tracking him, could see the tracers starting to reach out toward him. He lined up his shot, his finger tightening on the trigger. And then something made him look. UP instinct, experience, the sixth sense that keeps combat pilots alive. 3 P-51s were diving on him from above. They had seen his attack run and were moving to intercept. Stigler abandoned his attack on the bomber and broke hard left, pulling his Bf-109 into a steep turn that pushed the aircraft to its structural limits. The G-forces crushed him into his seat. His vision tunneled. He fought to stay conscious, fought to keep the aircraft under control, fought to survive the next 10 seconds. The Mustangs followed him into the turn. Stigler knew they would. The Mustang could turn insider. Bf-109, the Mustang was faster in level flight. The Mustang could climb faster. The Mustang had better visibility from its bubble canopy. The Mustang had more ammunition. The Mustang had longer range. The Mustang was better in every measurable way except one. The Bf-109 could dive slightly faster slightly. It was the only advantage Stigler had, and it wasn't much of an advantage. Stigler rolled inverted and pulled into a split S, diving for the deck. The Mustangs followed. Tracers streaked past his canopy. One round hit his left wing, punching through the thin aluminum skin. Stigler pushed the throttle to emergency power, coaxing every last bit of speed from his engine. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 20,000 feet, 15,000, 10,000. The ground was coming up fast, but Stigler kept diving. It was his only chance. At 5,000 feet, Stigler pulled out of the dive, the G-forces almost causing him to black out. He leveled off just above the treetops, flying at maximum speed toward the east, toward Germany, toward safety. He glanced behind him. The Mustangs had broken off the pursuit. They had climbed back to altitude to rejoin the bomber formation. They didn't need to chase him. They had already accomplished their mission. They had driven him away from the bombers. They had made him run. Stigler flew back to his base at low altitude, his hands shaking, his heart pounding. He hadn't fired a single shot. He hadn't damaged a single bomber. He had done nothing except survive. And survival, he was beginning to understand, was becoming the only victory that German pilots could hope for. When Stigler landed and taxied to his revetment, he sat in the cockpit for a long moment before climbing out. His crew chief approached, asking if there was any damage to report. Stigler looked at the single bullet hole in his wing and said nothing. What was there to say? The real damage wasn't to the aircraft. The real damage was to something inside him, to his confidence, to his belief that skill and experience could overcome any obstacle. The Mustang had shattered that belief. Of the 15 fighters that had taken off that morning, only 11 returned. 4 pilots were dead, shot down by Mustangs while trying to attack the bombers. 4 more experten who would never share their knowledge with the young pilots, who were being rushed through training to replace the mounting losses. The mathematics of attrition was simple and brutal. Germany was losing pilots faster than it could train new ones. And the Mustang was the primary reason why. That evening, Stigler sat in the pilot's ready room with the other survivors. Nobody spoke. They drank coffee and stared at the walls and tried not to think about the next mission. Someone had posted a drawing on the wall, a crude sketch of a P-51 Mustang with the words Der Teufel written beneath it. The devil, that's what German pilots were calling the Mustang now. The devil's own fighter. A young pilot, fresh from training school with maybe 20 hours of flying time, asked Stigler what the Mustang was like to fight. Stigler looked at the young man, this boy who would probably be dead within a month, and tried to find words to explain something that couldn't really be explained. How do you explain what it's like to fly an aircraft that's inferior in every way to your opponent's aircraft? How do you explain what it's like to know, before the fight even begins, that you're going to lose? How do you explain the feeling of being hunted in the sky by something faster and more deadly than anything you can do to counter it? Don't fight it, Stigler finally said. If you see a Mustang, run. Dive for the deck and run. That's the only advice I can give you. The young pilot looked confused. Run. That wasn't what he had been taught. He had been taught to be aggressive, to attack, to never give up the initiative. But Stigler knew better. Stigler had seen what happened to pilots who tried to fight Mustangs. He had seen the empty bunks. He had seen the personnel officers crossing names off the roster. He had seen too much. Over the next weeks and months, Stigler watched as the Luftwaffe died, not all at once, not in a single catastrophic battle, but slowly, inevitably, worn down by attrition that couldn't be sustained. Every day, more pilots were killed. Every day, more aircraft were destroyed. Every day, the American bomber streams flew deeper into Germany with their Mustang escorts, and every day German fighters became less and less capable of stopping them. The fuel situation became critical. Aviation gasoline was being rationed. Some days, fighters sat on the ground not because they were damaged, not because there were no pilots to fly them, but because there was no fuel. Missions were prioritized. Only the most important bomber raids would be intercepted. The rest would be allowed through unopposed. Germany's cities burned while German fighters sat idle, unable to take off because there was no fuel. Pilot morale collapsed. Men who had been flying since the beginning of the war, men with dozens or hundreds of combat missions, began refusing to fly. Some claimed illness, some claimed equipment problems, some simply refused to report for duty. Courts-martial followed, but even the threat of execution couldn't force men to climb into aircraft they knew were inferior and fly against an enemy they knew they couldn't defeat. Stigler flew less and less frequently. Officially, it was because he was needed to train new pilots. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth. Stigler had lost his nerve. The expertin who had flown for 100 missions, who had 28 confirmed kills, who had survived for years of continuous combat, had finally reached his breaking point. And he wasn't alone. Across the Luftwaffe, the same story was repeating itself. Experienced pilots were finding reasons not to fly. The ones who did fly were being killed at unsustainable rates. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. There were still aircraft, there were still pilots, but there was no fuel, no ammunition, no spare parts, no hope. American bombers flew over Germany in broad daylight, unopposed, destroying whatever they wanted to destroy. The Mustangs flew escort, but increasingly there were no German fighters for them to fight. The air war was over. The Mustang had won. After the war, Stigler was interviewed by Allied intelligence officers. They wanted to know about German fighter tactics, about aircraft performance, about training methods, but mostly, they wanted to know about the P-51 Mustang. They wanted to know what German pilots had thought of it. Stigler's answer was simple and devastating. We feared it more than anything else, he said. More than your bombers, more than your artillery, more than your tanks. The Mustang destroyed the Luftwaffe, not all at once, but piece by piece, pilot by pilot, until there was nothing left. It wasn't just that the Mustang was a better aircraft, though it was that the Mustang meant we couldn't protect our cities. We couldn't stop your bombers. We couldn't do our job. And when a fighter pilot can't do his job, when he knows every time he takes off that he's probably not coming back, something breaks inside him. That's what the Mustang did. It broke us. The interviewer asked if there was anything Germany could have done differently, any tactical, or technical solution that might have changed the outcome. Stigler thought for a long moment before answering. "We could have built a better fighter," he said. "We tried. The jets, the rockets, all the wonder weapons that were supposed to save us. But we ran out of time. We ran out of fuel. We ran out of pilots. And mostly, we ran out of hope. Because once we understood what the Mustang could do, once we realized that American industry could build those aircraft in numbers we couldn't match, we knew the war was lost." Some of us knew it in 1944, some took longer to accept it, but we all knew it eventually. The Mustang made sure of that. The P-51 Mustang didn't win World War II by itself, but it won the air war over Europe. It did what no other aircraft could do. It gave American bombers the freedom to operate over Germany without prohibitive losses. It destroyed the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. It broke the morale of German fighter pilots, and in doing so, it ensured that Germany would lose the war. For Franz Stigler, the memory of the Mustang never faded. Decades after the war, he would still sometimes wake up at night, his heart racing, his hands shaking, reliving those moments when he had looked up and seen the silver fighters diving on him from above. The fear never completely went away. The feeling of helplessness never completely went away, because the Mustang had taken something from him that he could never get back. It had taken his confidence. It had taken his belief in his own invincibility. It had taken his willingness to fly into combat knowing he might not come back. And he wasn't alone. Thousands of German pilots carried those same memories, those same fears, those same nightmares. They had faced the best aircraft Germany could build against the best aircraft America could build, and they had lost. Not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked skill, but because they were flying inferior aircraft against an opponent who had superior technology, superior numbers, and superior industrial capacity. The Mustang proved something that many military theorists had debated for years. In modern warfare, technological superiority matters. Industrial capacity matters. The German pilots who faced the Mustang learned that lesson the hard way, and many of them paid for that lesson with their lives.